What I want to talk about is the idea of political change. And I know this is something which is slightly relevant in the context of an coming general election. And I want to cast your mind back to the early summer of 2014, when there was an imminent election and the election seemed headed in one particular direction. And there was a lot of excitement, which is very predictable, especially in a place like India, where everything is very noisy, very rumbustious, and always very colorful. And there was a mood of alarm which went into the minds of some people. For the sake of convenience, let us call them public intellectuals. And these people believed that what India was confronted was a stark, unholy choice which would result in the fundamental destruction of India, of the idea of India. And they believed that the choices people were going to exercise were deeply uncomfortable and went against the entire grain of the Indian experience. I'm willfully not adding names to what the characters are, but I think most people understand, especially if they experienced that in 2014, in the summer of 2014. Now, 5 years later, we are confronted with yet another election. Some of that same rhetoric is likely to persist. But the question which a lot of people need to answer, especially those who raised it, is that has India changed? Has the idea of India been completely destroyed? Has India, the soul of India, been emasculated? Is it the case that we have the minorities of India cowering in their ghettos, frightened of their lives, frightened of their modes of worship, frightened of their very existence? Is it that somehow some ugly majoritarian tendencies have taken over? Has the constitution been destroyed? Now, if I raise these questions, people will say, oh, these are non-issues, really. I mean, don't exaggerate things. I'm not exaggerating. There's a certain image which was projected. So the alternative rhetoric which has come about is that, well, actually nothing has changed. India remains exactly what it was 5 years ago, and that we are 5 years later, we are experiencing a wave of utmost disappointment, an exercise in futility, false dawn, false promises, false hopes. The question really is, how do we assess political change? Has there been change? Has there been a new spirit of India which has been kindled? Now, if we can say X amount of roads have been built, X amount of how much some rivers have been cleaned, some electricity connections have been given, we can reel out statistics in that way. And no doubt some of these statistics are very, very impressive. I don't have all the statistics before me. But that is one facet of what a government sets out to do. A government sets out to improve the lives of people. In some cases, the lives of people improve. In some cases, it deteriorates. Overall, sometimes we have a certain feel-good factor. The stock market goes up. Sometimes it goes down. The currency fluctuates, etc., etc. But how does political change affect the lives of people, the spirit of India? Has there been that change in that spirit? There are two facets which I would argue. And I'm not going into road construction, and I'm not going into electricity connections, I'm not going into gas connection, I'm not going into education policies, I'm not going into the cacophony which greets us on television every day. What are these two fundamental changes which has happened in India? The most important change, as I can see it, and I think this is something which really affects the spirit of India, the soul of India, the very basis on which we are. You know, in the late 18th century, one of the Governor Generals, Lord Cornwallis, he said, "Verily I say unto you, all the natives in Hindustan are corrupt." And in his deposition to the House of Commons, Clive said, "But giving bakshish is a standard part of Indian life. What I did was nothing unusual. And for them to give me bakshish equally was nothing unusual." The idea of a debased people whose soul had been corrupted by various things, basically a lack of sovereignty, basically a destruction of culture, etc., had been very much there. And it had permeated into the soul. And the idea that there should be no distinction between private wealth and public wealth had become very deep-rooted, especially amongst the political classes. And I think the most important change which we have noticed in the past 5 years is that for the first time since 1947, or maybe even before that, we have started rolling back the tide of corruption. Corruption hasn't ended, don't get me wrong. Corruption hasn't ended. It still exists. It still eats into the soul of India. But at one level, at the top, there has been a huge exponential drop. And that's why I'm saying we've started, the tide was always advancing. We were getting corrupt, corrupter, corruptist, maybe taking liberties with the English language. Now we've started rolling back. And that doesn't please a lot of people. And that doesn't please a lot of people, but they can't say it. So they find other ways of expressing it. Ways of expressing it depend. Saying no, they establish a moral equivalence, etc. So that's the first point, I would say.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.